Hi class. This week as you read your short stories, I want you to be able to identify what a metaphor, simile, analogy, and allegory are. We will break down Gracie Lake as an allegory at the end of this slideshow. So pay attention and take some notes. Reach out with any questions if you have them. Metaphor, I'm sure you have studied before. It is a literary device that compares two things. It is a way to say that those two things share a similar quality. It is not something that can be taken literally. It is a figurative literary device. When you say, I'm drowning in work, it doesn't mean you're actually drowning. It means that you're feeling overwhelmed, and that helplessness of drowning is associated with the amount of work that you may have. Metaphors are everywhere. He's a couch potato. She's got a heart of gold. The party was the bomb. Money is the root of all evil. Swear words and slang are often metaphorical. Take bullshit, for example. Obviously, we understand what that term means. It doesn't actually mean poop or bull poop. By bringing those items together to compare, we can create the idea of clarity and help someone to understand the emphasis of what we are saying. This quote here by H.P. Lovecraft uses a lot of imagery to suggest the limits of our knowledge in a metaphorical way. We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. So the entire quote there is a metaphor. So the extended metaphor is one that goes on for several sentences. And the controlling metaphor is something that we often see when the metaphor continues across the entire piece of writing. So throughout the entire novel, throughout the entire poem, we have seen metaphors work throughout plays and film. The novel, The Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison, uses the extended metaphor of invisibility to describe how Black men and women are often overlooked in American society, how they are often pushed to the margins and into the shadows, and therefore feel invisible. So that metaphor continues throughout the novel and works in several different ways. So oftentimes metaphors are not used just for style, just to create an exaggeration in the mind of the reader. They're used to create the theme, the lesson, the idea in which the author is pushing all the way throughout their writing. A simile is a metaphor. You just include the words like, as, or than. Anthony used to be as strong as an ox. Obviously, does not mean that Anthony really does portray the equal strength of an ox, but it means that he was once very, very strong. Her phone buzzed like a beehive. That creates that sound imagery in our minds where we can hear her phone buzzing because we have heard the sound of bees before. So similes and metaphors can be used to create sort of that lyrical, beautiful language in the mind of the reader to bring certain aspects to life. An analogy is something that shows how two things are alike, but with the ultimate goal of making a point about that comparison. So very similar, but a little bit more complex than a simile or a metaphor. So what is the difference? So here are some examples to sort of highlight the difference for you. A metaphor is life is a box of chocolates. Simile is life is like a box of chocolates. And analogies have the two parts. Life is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. An allegory is different. An allegory is an extended metaphor where objects, persons, and actions in a narrative are equated with meanings outside of that narrative. So obviously, the allegory can have more of a moral, social, religious, or political significance, and often relatable to the context of the author. The author has an agenda or a purpose for that writing, and therefore the allegory is created. So Gracie Lake, as you will read this week, or as you have already read, is an allegory of the war in Vietnam. Some have taken this and really dug into the text in order to make the comparisons, as I have done here for you in this PowerPoint. And even though our author, T.C. Boyle, did not go to Vietnam, he was well aware of what was happening over there. He was the age of the men who were being drafted, and in order to elude the draft, went to college instead. That was a way to take your name out of the draft. And so he would have been very aware of the horrors in Vietnam, as were many Americans during that time who were at home protesting. So obviously the Vietnam War was an extremely long conflict, changed the face of America forever. It was the first time in American history where the American people did not support a war, did not support the boys going over to war, but young boys were very gung-ho about being called to serve their country. They would have fathers and grandfathers who served in World War I and World War II, and those men were all considered heroes. They would have been portrayed in different films at that time. They would have seen John Wayne and different wars that included actors like Jimmy Stewart and Clark Gable, who served as soldiers in the war, and would have been very excited to take up arms and head to a foreign country to defend our freedoms here in America. So obviously it's one of the most controversial and debated wars in American history. You probably have learned a lot about the Vietnam War, but it was the first war that was televised, so the American people were able to see some of the horrors that were happening, and in turn started to doubt the reason why we were there, started to question the soldiers' morals who were over there, and really started to want to put an end to this conflict. And this was the first time also that there was a lot of protests going on in America against the war. The peace movement became very large. And also when the Vietnam veterans were coming home, they were not praised and given parades and shown honor like soldiers in the past. Because of the things that the American people had seen on TV, they were often ostracized and criticized and harassed, and the soldiers had experienced the traumatic effects of war and were not able to deal with it, as they were not given the services that they needed to deal with PTSD. So how does our story, Gracie Lake, represent this war? Well, as mentioned, the innocent boys were very excited to take up arms in our country, just like our main characters. They were very excited about the idea of being bad. They did not understand the consequences of this, just like the soldiers who wanted to go over and fight. They didn't understand what that really meant. At the age of 18, 19, their innocence was quickly stolen away. The average age of the soldiers in Vietnam was 19, and this is the age of all three of our main characters. So obviously, I'm asking you this week in your quiz to find evidence in the story to support the connection between our characters and the idea of being bad. And I ask you, are they truly bad? And that's for you to decide, that's for you to analyze. But keeping in mind that the boys were young, they were innocent, they were trying to fit into this ideal that they didn't really understand at the time. So there's another connection, the destruction of the land itself. The Vietnam countryside was completely obliterated by the bombing campaigns and the use of chemical defoliants like Agent Orange, landmines. There was bombing pretty much consistently throughout the entire war, so the country itself is completely scarred even to this day. That connects to our setting in Gracie Lake when we're looking at the lake itself. It was once a land of purity. It was called Wakan by the Indians, a reference to the clarity of its waters. But as this quote tells us, now it is fetid and murky, the mud banks glittering with broken glass and strewn with beer cans and the charred remains of bonfires. There was a single ravaged island 100 yards from shore, so stripped of vegetation it looked as if the Air Force had strafed it. So this comparison, obviously, to the setting pulls us into that allegory as well. So there were obviously several tactical errors in the war. One of them is referenced in the story by Boyle. He says, this was a tactical error as damaging and irreversible in its way as Westmoreland's decision to dig in at Khai San. So Khai San, our soldiers were stuck there for days and they weren't able to get reinforcements. They weren't able to get supplies because pretty soon they were surrounded by the enemy. And we lost a lot of soldiers during this particular campaign. And in our story, the narrator's own tactical error is dropping the keys and assuming that the person in the car in front of them was a friend, so that misidentifying their target in the attack. And obviously, if you know much about Vietnam, you'll know that we did not really understand the target and we underestimated them as well. So we thought that we had the military advantage, that we were guaranteed a success. We went in with all of our firepower and all of our technology. And what we didn't realize during the war was that relying too heavily on the military and all of that firepower, we just created more and more enemies. The more we bombed, it strengthened their forces. It created that sort of guerrilla warfare. Imagine if you lived in a small village and your entire village was obliterated by an enemy and you had nothing left, you would probably join forces against that enemy. That's what happened in Vietnam. So we miscalculated the strength and the idea of resistance. And our characters in the story, too, they didn't really understand the range of what might happen if the person in the car wasn't who they thought it was. So they came into contact with this man who was obviously just trying to protect his girlfriend in that situation, but who was very tough and actually was able to take on all three of them in a fight. So the narrator states, the greasy character was unimpressed. He merely backed off a step, his face like a Toltec mask, and laid Digby out with a single whistling roundhouse blow. So this man knew what he was doing. He knew how to handle himself in a fight. So there's some dehumanizing that goes on during wartime. Obviously, to ease the moral burden of war, it's common practice to dehumanize the enemy. We use derogatory names to speak of them. That makes it easier to pull the trigger and sleep at night, not thinking about your foe as actual people. The longer you are there, the longer you do this, the easier it is to forget completely, even those you are helping blur into the mire. This was written by a Vietnam soldier during an interview. And we see the same thing happening in our short story. After the fight, the narrator says, we were standing over him in a circle, gritting our teeth, jerking our necks, our limbs and hands and feet twitching with glandular discharges. No one said anything. We just stared down at the guy, the car freak, the lover, the bad, greasy character, laid low. So this man no longer is a person in their eyes. He is just the enemy who therefore became the car freak, the lover, the bad, greasy character who needed to be knocked out. So this is a slippery slope. When we dehumanize people, we can do terrible things to them. So it's estimated that thousands of women were victims of rape during the Vietnam War. that this is just what was reported, so obviously that's terrifying to think about. In the story as well, the boys attack with the idea of raping the girl, who they called the Fox. She was the greasy character's girlfriend, and shrieked when she saw him lying on the ground. She was wearing panties and a man's shirt along with red toenail polish. So the boys' humanity was quickly stripped away with that fight. That prospect that they may have killed a man, all of their other morals were placed aside as well. They no longer felt human themselves. They no longer saw the enemy as human, and were giving in to all of those sort of animalistic desires. They moved into this sort of primitive state of survival, just like people do, and when they're serving their country and their soldiers in another place, you have to put certain things aside in order to simply survive. Now, this is the reason why war is so terrible and why soldiers come home and suffer from PTSD, because they are, in fact, hurting, killing, raping human beings. And that realization just cannot go away, no matter how you try. So the swamp itself, obviously, again, connecting the setting in Vietnam to the setting in our story. So after the fight and after the almost rape, they're forced to run into the swamp because a car pulls in and they are frightened. So they run into the swamp, and they are engulfed with this sort of mysterious dark waters, this sort of putrid, smells, and the landscape in Vietnam itself was often described as swamp-like. The soldiers didn't know what kind of animals or dangers lurked beneath. There were muddy, humid conditions. The country itself, they said, was actually trying to kill them. So we have this moment where the main character is in the swamp, and he feels the dead, bloated, dead body next to him, and this sort of a metaphor for his entire situation, right? This could easily be him floating there as a dead person, how quickly things have turned, and the swamp obviously represents all of that. So as they're sort of hiding and waiting for them to leave, we see our main characters alone, and they're scared, and he says he is alone, scared, and sharing the water with a bloated dead body. He is aware of the metaphor. He's aware that this could be him. So this hiding and waiting definitely connects to the Vietnam War. The soldiers oftentimes didn't have a clear sense of where they were heading, what they were supposed to do, what might be coming for them. They lie and wait, listening for dangers, aware of the possibility of death around the corner. And then that quiet waiting time often would be more detrimental to them than the actual movement, the actual moving forward, the battles, all of those things. It gives your mind a place to put all of that energy. When we have quiet time, we start to reflect, we start to think, and sometimes that can be a war in and of itself. So I mentioned a couple different times PTSD, and the soldiers, obviously, who came home from Vietnam would have these psychological traumas. They would have flashbacks, nightmares. They would not get treated properly. And we see that same thing happened to our main characters. At the very end of the story, the protagonist described him and his friends as zombies, like war veterans, deaf and dumb pencil peddlers. He says, "I wanted to get out of the car and retch. I wanted to go home to my parents' house and crawl into bed." So this idea of PTSD happened to our main characters just as it did the Vietnam soldiers. The very beginning of the story, the protagonist describes the party scene at Gracie Lake and a typical night for him and his friends, and says this was nature. This same line is continued and repeated at the end of the story when the narrator describes the sun rising in the morning over the wreck of his mother's car and the stillness of the world around him. He says this was nature. Obviously, this repetition is important, and the the line means something very different at the end of the story than it did to our main character in the beginning.